Yes, thank you for bringing Vanda and ask her to share with us she's experience on this. I want to ask you to introduce yourself again for the people who maybe don't know you and maybe to underline something what you like to share with them about yourself, about what are you doing.
Okay, my name is Peter Moon, which most of you know, and this is my 6th time at Atlanticron, and I'm very touched to be here and to meet so many of you and new faces and old faces. So I will skip the part about my feelings because I'm sure you all understand how special it is to be here. And I'm an author. You are all part of my dream. I had dreams before I started becoming a writer. I dreamt that I was in Transylvania, and I changed a black bat into a white bat. This will be the subject of my next book. It's called The White Bat, The Alchemy of Writing, which will be published sometime next year. And my dreams have brought me here. They brought me by way of writing about time. And I'll be speaking about that shortly, but first I'm going to introduce Vanda. I will explain the context of why we're here and how we're here, but first I'm going to have Vanda introduce herself briefly.
Hello? Hi. The first thing I'd like to say is I'm very honored and thankful to be here. It is such a joy to be here, and I have to admit, I work a lot with the Indigenous elders. And when I saw the theme of this conference is "We Can Make a Difference," it is so appropriate because that is the exact energies that are here now. It's all about us. It's all about you. It's all about me. It's all about us coming together. So thank you from the bottom of my heart. A little bit about myself. In 1983, I saved every penny I had and went to Egypt on a metaphysical trip. And I was a Rosicrucian. I had been involved in a lot of esoteric schools. But what happened was amazing. In front of the paws of the Sphinx, I asked, I was a single divorced mother, how can I serve and how can I make a living? I did not hear a voice, but what I heard was the feeling of the words, bring sparkly people to sacred places for the remembrance. And I looked up and I said, I don't have a clue what that means. But 3 months later, my Theosophy teacher asked me to co-host Greece and Egypt. And then the year after, I developed a company called Joy Travel, Transformational Journeys from the Heart. And I've taken over people groups, 40 trips to Egypt, 26 to Peru, and various sacred sites all over the world. And I'm here to tell you they are alive, because the earth is alive. So, more to come.
Thank you, Vanda. Now, I will begin, I try to put everything in as much context as possible and in the context of Atlanticron. At the same time, I had written this story. It was a dream, and it was called The White Bat. And then I began writing a book. What do people want to read about? Because I was in advertising and design, and I wanted to be a writer my whole life. It was my dream to be a writer. When I read the stories of Ray Bradbury and Arthur C. Clarke, I wanted to do that for people. So I said, what do people want to read about? Well, everybody loves Atlantis. Whether they admit it or not, there's so many books on Atlantis, it's ridiculous. I said, this is something that can sell to the world. There's always room for another book on Atlantis. I began writing a story about Atlantis, which is still not published, but it picks up on some of the themes later in life. But although the dream and the writing process had begun, I hadn't actualized things. But what I ended up writing about through meeting remarkable people was about the subject of time. Now, I was brought here in 2008 by Dr. David Anderson, who you're very fortunate to see a virtual presentation tomorrow night, which I unfortunately will miss. I will catch it later. He brought me here. His research is amazing. I know him well, practically as well as anybody. And his technology is incredible. So he's actually controlling time, he's slowing it up and speeding it down. You can listen to an interview of him on YouTube with Art Bell, which will talk about the prospect of actually putting people into a time chamber and sending them, so to speak, places. His work is evolved far beyond what you will hear him say. He always says this. So the reason David became interested in me, because I had written a book called The Montauk Project: Experiments in Time. I wrote it I was basically the ghostwriter for Preston Nichols, a scientist from Long Island who had been involved in time experiments. And when David read the book, my skills were in decoding Preston's technicalese, because some of the technicalese was too complicated for certainly a layman to understand, and many of the concepts most physicists or scientists hadn't heard of. What that book did, though, was change the establishment's views on time. And they had to respond differently because there were too many questions. It started a revolution in Hollywood, which I've not been able to benefit from as far as having a movie, because they take the meme, the idea, and kind of reinvent it in a way that doesn't violate the copyright, but they adulterate it. It's not, the true story hasn't been told. Now, the Montauk Project Experiments in Time, David read, and he said to me that it opened up his spirituality, because, and he began looking at different things. Right before I met him in person, he had been to Atlanticron, invited because somebody had to cancel. He was in Germany, he came here, and he fell in love with the place. And he came, he visited me at my house in Long Island and said, I want to start a foundation for Romanian artists and writers and youth. And this has become the World Genesis Foundation, which helps to sponsor Atlanticron and hopes to take it export Atlanticron, which I hope to be a friend of and a helper of in this regard for the future. One of the windows into the future, which is the theme of this year's Atlanticron. Now, the Experiments in Time book focused on a point that we're moving into in the next few days, called the cosmic pulse, the biorhythms of the Earth. Vanda is going to pass out a sheet which shows, you all have to pass it around because she's only got one copy, of the grid points of the Earth, which reflect the biorhythms of the Earth. And every part of this is, what I'm going to say is fact, part of it is lore, and part of it is history. Is every year around August 10th to 14th, known as the dog days of August, there is a very strong cosmic pulse or biorhythm. And this biorhythm was honored in the ancient days of Egypt when Sirius was the closest to us in the night sky. The distance was closest. It's called the dog days of August because the Sirius is known as the dog star. And this was the high holy days of Egypt, sometimes called the birthday of Isis, August 12th. August 12th, and I don't think it's a coincidence, but is when Napoleon went into the king's chamber when he had invaded Egypt. And he had invaded Egypt for esoteric reasons, himself being very involved in secret societies. But this August 12th date became prominent in the Montauk Project because all of the Montauk Project begins in 1943 with the Philadelphia experiment, which was the forerunner of today's stealth technology, when it was on this date, according to the lore of the Philadelphia experiment, August 12, 1943, was when this ship was, they prepared invisibility, which was the forerunner of stealth technology. When it actually disappeared on, with scopes or screens or from visual sight, it actually went out of this dimension. And the people aboard became discombobulated. Physically, sometimes mentally, their auras. So this became a huge human factor study to why can't people withstand this displacement of time and space. in one of David Anderson's experiments, when they reversed the aging process on a plant, it got scorched. It was like an atomic meltdown. This was part of their learning curve. So we do know that this type of phenomena does occur. People were supposed to combust spontaneously. Now, that technology, which was designed to keep ships from being attacked by having them disappear on sonar or radar screens of submarines, had to be shelved. The war was going to be won by the Allies because of the atomic bomb. Using this stealth technology was too high of a hazard to the health of the people. So they became a human factor study, which went to Brookhaven Labs in Long Island, and eventually moved out to Montauk Point, which is the eastern end of the South Fork of Long Island. And it was a sacred point to the Montauk Indians, who were known as the Pharaohs, the Montauk Pharaohs, because their descendants had been from Egypt. Now, if you understand, as my friends here, Florine being one of them, who taught me that all the gold in Egypt came from this area, from Transylvania. It's been tested. So you have an ancient heritage here of settling Egypt, the Egypt migrating to New York, Montauk, New York, the sacred area where the time experiments were done, which I did the search on the property and found out, well, it was ancient sacred Native American land. And to this day, the deed is very obscure, the legalities of it. And all of the deed, energy around the deed and the court dockets all reverberate around these numbers, 666. You know, the date of the deed is 6 February 1666 or something like this. It's this synchronicity with the biblical symbolism of 666, which is basically the physical plane. We're a carbon-based universe. There's 6 protons, 6 neutrons, and 6 electrons in the atom. So this is symbolic. This is where science fiction becomes reality. If we want to call the Bible, we can call the Bible whatever we want. We can call it scripture, but if we look at it as fiction, it's where it's meeting, or even scripture, it's meeting reality when you see it, how it interflows with the actual deed of the property and the court cases that were done. The Montauk Indians were declared extinct, although they existed because it was politically expedient to do so. I've done a book called Pyramids of Montauk, which goes into this, many sequels to the Montauk Project, which involved my investigations with synchronicity. And when the linear investigation trail cuts off, because you have a secret project where people are shredding documents and hiding it, there's still a trail. It's said that atoms have a memory. I can't speak for that, not being a physicist or a chemist, but there are physicists and chemists who do. It's just like the universe is like a hard disk that crashes. You can recover it. What I have experienced is synchronicity, and synchronicity has brought me places. I've had a lot of synchronicity in Romania, and what I've learned about it is partly from Carl Jung, who was the man who coined the word synchronicity. It is the precursor to the Tao, the T-A-O in English, or the ancient underlying principle of creation, the Tao. The true Tao is that which cannot be named. There are indications that this Taoism, Lao Tse, strong indications, strong legends that he came from Bulgaria. And when you say Bulgaria, the Romanians and the Bulgarians, when you go into ancient history, there's not much difference. The Thracians, the Proto-Thracians. So a friend of mine in Bulgaria who's been to Atlanticron, Milko, he told me that when one of his friends went to China in the old kingdom, which was once the kingdom of Ordos, where Lao Tse lived, when he said that he was Bulgarian, they treated him with a lot of respect and honor because they recognized this tradition of Lao Tse's family being Bulgarian. And Ordos is where we get the word order, because everything in this community was in order. The English word order. So Ordos is where we get the word order in English. Now, the synchronicities have been too much to describe in a short lecture like this. I can go off onto many different threads. I could give an hour lecture on this thread, that thread, and there's all very interesting. But I want to stay relevant to the topic of Romania and Atlanticron. So David had embraced me after he had been to Romania. He put up my first website and helped me. He wanted to help me. I misunderstood at the time, but at the same time my books were being, the Montauk project was put into Romanian by a man named Sorin Hormuz, who is the owner and editor of Daksha Publishing in Bucharest. And he was working for as an editor for another publisher, and the publisher says, read this book, the Montauk Project, I want to know if we should publish it. He reads it, he says, yes, we should publish it. He says, no, I don't want to do it. So Serene went out on his own and created his own publishing company called Daksha Publishing, based upon the Montauk Project, which is how I started my own publishing company. I realized that this data would not necessarily work by having somebody else publish it, because they wouldn't process the information correctly. So I did it myself. I was also told I would benefit more by doing it myself, which is obvious. It's not easy to make money as a writer. Being a publisher is a good way. And today, those of you who want to write, I recommend you do ebooks and print on demand, because if you sell 100 copies, you'll make more money than if you sell thousands of copies going to a regular publisher, whether it be in Romania or America. And many of you who in Romania who write do not write for money, but if you consider that aspect or the energy you get back, it's very easy to publish yourself. Then there's two arts. First there's the art of writing, and then there's a second art which is very important for aspiring writers or existing writers, and that is the art of getting your art accepted and as a currency. And that is, there's two separate art forms there, and you must learn both of them. That's just a side comment. But I was fortunate to be successful in becoming a publisher, but Sorin was also successful in printing this book and the sequels, and then he began to attract books of similar topics, and there's many people he has published. And right after the Montauk Project was released, he got a manuscript from a Romanian author that was very secretive, Radu Shinamar, and the book, how do you say the name of the book, Serene, in Romanian? It's a tough title to translate into English. It's Viitor, it's a death head.
Viitor cu cap de mort.
Say it?
Viitor cu cap de mort. Future with death head.
Future with Death's Head?
Yes.
Okay. That's what he called it. When it was given to me, it was called The Enemy Within, meaning the enemy within Romania. And it was a book where he met a remarkable man named Cezar Brad, who was born with a huge umbilical cord that they had to saw off. The authorities the security was, the doctors were trained to report it to security. And Cezar Brad was put in the hands of a Dr. Zen from China, who was set up this paranormal department called Department Zero, which was more secretive than the SSI, and it was funded by a Romanian who had contacts in the military. He was a Romanian military man who had contacts in Uruguay. So, and this investment company, it was all very secretive and funded this secret, according to this book. And there was this chamber discovered. As Cezar grew up, he became the head of this department. He was trained by this Chinese doctor, and they discovered this. It's a long story, but I'll make it very brief for those of you who are not already familiar. The Pentagon in the United States discovered, with certain ground-penetrating radar from satellites, a chamber beneath the Buchej, beneath the Babele and the Sphinx. And deep in there was a chamber with holographic records where it would show the history, like a video in holographic form, but it was bioresonant with whoever would see it. So if you would see it, you would see different things than I would see. I consider this a mind amplification. It's somehow reading what's in the history of your DNA and projecting it outwards. There were also tables like this that were 6 foot high, where if you put your hand over the table, it would read out your DNA in holographic form. If you would put it closer, it would be more microscopic onto the molecular level, then closer to the atomic level. When I read this book, I said, this is great science fiction, but it was purported to be true. Now, if you put your hand, say here, and then on another section of the table, it would holographically read out the stars of a star system, a planet, with a creature, the DNA of another creature. And at the same time, you put them together, it shows a hybridization. So here we have a Noah's Ark and then some. It makes the biblical story of Noah's Ark sound like a cartoon in comparison, because all of experience comes from the deeper recesses of the archetypes of what we are, our DNA. It's all buried in there. Now, this book was very interesting to read, but when David Anderson faded out of my life, it was really 2001 he began to fade. And in 2001, he had called me to his apartment in Kings Park, Long Island. He says, I want to talk to you. So he invited me to dinner at his apartment. And when I get to the apartment, it was a 2-bedroom apartment. It was very nice in a suburban neighborhood. It was modest but nice, tucked away, kind of secret. He says, there's only one other person who's been here, because he's very secretive, and I felt kind of honored to be with him. And he wanted to talk about 2 things. He wanted to talk about doing an event on time travel, which his Time Travel Research Center was going to sponsor, and have physicists from all over the East Coast come. And he was going to have other speakers, but he wanted myself and Preston Nichols to talk about the Montauk project. And he's always tried to promote my work, which is very flattering, being that he's such a brilliant scientist. And the work that is published as the Montauk project has some flaws in it, only because Preston Nichols does not know everything. And it's a little flawed, but it's interesting, and it takes us a further step into the final frontier of time. Now, David at that meeting, he says, I have an uneasy feeling. He says, I have been asked to go to Moscow. When he says asked, we just had the first Persian Gulf, was it 2001? I can't even remember. That was the invasion of Iraq. The United States had invaded Iraq in October. This was November. And he said, I've been told to go to Moscow, and I've only to bring my passport and my airline ticket. Anything else I won't be able to take with me. I don't have an easy feeling. If I don't come back in 2 weeks, they told me I'd come back in 2 weeks. If I don't come back, make some noise, because you're the only one who can make some noise. I can't make a lot of noise. I have a newsletter. I'm not like the real media. But I said, I will do my best. And David acquired the assets of the Moscow Aviation Institute, which is actually where he ended up at some point in Moscow, which he still doesn't talk about. He won't talk about that trip because there's something confidential of the security oaths that he gives to the United States government. And at that particular moment in time, it was also very curious because I mentioned something about some interaction I had with the Chinese at a book fair in Frankfurt, and they had sent me a New Year's card, and I was saying that the Chinese have I hadn't heard from them in years, and they sent me out of the blue a New Year's card, season's greetings card. And he says, yes, I know. He says, I have some cards, and he takes me over to his mantle of, I think it was a fireplace, but it was a mantle, and he has all these cards, and they're all from the heads of countries. President of China, he showed it to me. So he's very interesting connections. But he was fading away at that time, and Serena's even told me a story where he had come to America and he didn't get to see they were going to show him the time chamber in Long Island. It was in Long Island or New Mexico? Long Island. And because we just had the Twin Towers blow up, there was a restriction on foreigners having access there. So Serene just missed it, unfortunately. I would love to have heard that. His experience. So the Time Travel Research Center in 2003, David had to shut it down because people had broken into it and whatnot. There was security issues. So in 2003, he says, I have all this information that I want to get rid of. I mean, I was going to create a time travel museum. I want to give it to you. I don't know who else to give it to. So Preston Nichols had a big van, because he says, so we went up with Preston's van to put all into Rochester, New York, which is about an 8-9 hour drive from Long Island where I live, and we crammed it all into the van. And David says, I said, would you like to go to dinner? Can we take you to dinner, David? He says, no, I can only spend about 15 minutes, which was very frustrating. We were hoping to talk to him. And we had a nice talk with him for 15 minutes. He was very, very sympathetic. He says, I won't be able to work with you again for 5 years. Maybe 4, but 5 years. He says, he basically had to go underground. This was 2003. It was on Easter Sunday, actually, or the night before Easter. And 5 years later, before 5 years, it was, I had a friend staying with me in Long Island, and he read Radu Shinomar's book. It had been sent to me 4 years earlier, but I didn't have time to read it because I'm very busy. A friend of mine was staying with me. I said, well, while I'm doing work, you can read this book. Tell me, I started it, but I couldn't finish it. I liked it. And he finished it, and he says, you must publish this book. So then the Qigong I was doing helped me because my car broke down. I was doing Qigong so much going into Brooklyn, which is a 45-minute drive, and driving all the time. My car broke down, and so I took it to one of my fellow students who was a mechanic to get a better price. As I sit in his, waiting room, which is a very small little place in Brooklyn, I read the book. I had time to read it. The Qigong helped me get time to read this book. I said, I like it. I want to publish it. I began negotiations with Serene Hormuz in December, and because Christmas is a big time here, it took until March to complete the negotiations and the back and forth. I said, I will publish your book in English. And right after I made the agreement to do this, it was resolved. I got an email from David Anderson, who I hadn't really heard from in 5 years, maybe a Christmas card or a message or a postcard now and then, and he said, I would like to invite you to Atlanticron. We will pay for your flight, and you can bring a person with you to come, a guest with you. So this is how I came to Atlanticron. I said, wow, this is 5 years. And I thought when I came here, David was going to give me answers about the Sphinx, because he works in this secret sector. The ground-penetrating radar from the Pentagon must use his technology because it came from satellites. And the satellites, how he learned about time control, because the time would, he learned how to warp space and time through the special theory of relativity, and they were he was called into service because satellites would move several meters every year in space. So this is how he got involved. And I think they're using his technology from the satellites. He must know about this. And when I got here, David really says he couldn't say anything to me. It was very frustrating. What he did tell me, finally, was that he had a new company. He was going to go back into the time travel business, and he created Anderson Multinational, which you'll see a logo up on the banner here, Anderson Multinational, which he's now, I don't know if that corporation is still intact, but he's got the Anderson Institute, which you can read about on the web. That went up just a few months ago. So David did not have answers for me. And when I went to the Sphinx, before I came to Atlanticron, they'd given me a 3-day cultural tour, which was a little rugged because it's a long story, but it wasn't so easy because our rooms were sold out and we had to adventure, not speaking Romanian. Our host from Atlanticron wasn't able to be there, so we were having adventures, and times we'll never forget. There were 3 of us in Romania, but I went to the Sphinx before I came to Atlanticron, and I asked the Sphinx, metaphorically, I said, what is the relationship between Radu and David? And when I came here, I did not get an answer, except that David, I was presented with a CD from Soren Humuz, which is a personal message from Radu, saying he would like to meet David Anderson. This told me that they two didn't know each other. Although David was told he had met Radu and should shaken hands with him under a different name. This is a little confusing, but in any event, I did not get the answers. The second year I came back and David lectured here on time. We lectured together. He always included me in his lectures, and it was a memorable experience for me, certainly. And he taught me about the invariance of the space-time